All right, get ready to dive in because today we're tackling Deuteronomy. We're going deep into excerpts from the entire book, and trust me, this is about way more than just ancient history.
It really is. Deuteronomy is, well, surprisingly relevant even now. Think about it this way. Imagine you're on the verge of a big life change. Maybe you're finally starting that dream job or picking up your life and moving to that city you've always dreamed of. Well, Deuteronomy speaks right to those moments. It encourages us to learn from where we've been and use it to prepare for what's ahead.
So it's like Moses giving a pep talk, but instead of a big game, it's inheriting the promised land.
Exactly. Picture this. After 40 years of wandering in the desert, the Israelites are camped on the plains of Moab. They can literally see their goal. It's a moment overflowing with anticipation, but it's also a crucial time to look back at their past and, reflect on the mistakes they made.
Okay, I'm with you. But why is reflecting on the past so important here?
Ever make a bad decision and say, never again?
Oh, yeah. More times than I can count.
Well, that's kind of what Moses is doing here, but on a much larger scale. He knew that repeating those past mistakes could cost them everything. He reminds them about their history, not just for nostalgia, but to highlight God's faithfulness and, well, their own tendency to, let's just say, mess things up a bit.
He definitely doesn't hold back. He even reminds them of how they almost threw it all away because they were scared, going back to slavery. Seriously.
It does seem crazy, right? But they were absolutely terrified of what was ahead. Deuteronomy describes the people they were about to encounter, the Anakim. These giant warriors who struck fear into their hearts. You can almost hear the fear in their voices. They cried out, "The people are bigger and taller than us. The cities are huge and fortified up to the sky." They were letting that fear overshadow all the miraculous things God had already done for them.
It's like that saying, fear can make your shadow look bigger than you are. It's a powerful reminder that even when we're afraid, even when things get tough, running back to what's familiar isn't always the answer, especially when God has something so much better in store.
Absolutely, and that's where this idea of a covenant really comes alive. This wasn't just a casual agreement with God. It was a binding promise, a sacred bond. It made them his chosen people. And all throughout their journey, God had shown himself to be faithful.
Okay, so covenant equals serious promise. Got it. But even with that promise, Moses doesn't sugarcoat anything. He's very clear that their actions will have very real consequences, both good and bad.
Exactly. And Deuteronomy paints a very vivid picture of those blessings and curses. And I'm not just talking about abstract spiritual concepts. I'm talking about the tangible everyday stuff.
Give me an example. What kind of everyday stuff are we talking?
Think abundant harvests, thriving families, victory in battle if they obey. But if they disobeyed, plagues, famine, defeat, even exile from that very land that they were about to inherit. Deuteronomy lays it all out there, no holds barred. It makes it very clear that their choices have very real consequences.
Okay, wow, those consequences were intense. It really makes you think about the weight of our choices. But it's not all doom and gloom, right? There are some really beautiful parts of Deuteronomy, too, like those laws about caring for the vulnerable, about social justice.
Oh, absolutely. Deuteronomy goes way beyond just personal piety. It's about building a just and compassionate society. You really see it in those laws about leaving the edges of your fields unharvested for the poor, about releasing debts, treating servants fairly.
Yeah. Those parts really stood out to me, especially the one about leaving part of your harvest for those in need. It makes you wonder how different our world would look if we actually applied that principle even now.
It's a radical idea, isn't it? Imagine being surrounded by all of these societies that worshipped, power, greed, then encountering these laws that put justice first, that put compassion for the vulnerable first. It really set them apart and showed everyone what it meant to be God's chosen people.
Totally. It's like they were called to be like a light in the darkness, a beacon of hope for a world that desperately needed it.
Exactly. Their faithfulness to God's laws, it was meant to be a testimony to all the nations around them. Don't forget, they were about to enter a land full of all these different beliefs, different practices.
Oh, right. Like all those different gods, the temples. It must have been tempting to just blend in.
It definitely would have been. And that's why Deuteronomy puts so much emphasis on this centralized worship. It was about protecting the purity of their devotion to Yahweh. It was about helping them stay true to that covenant, especially amidst all those temptations.
Okay, I think I'm starting to see how all these pieces fit together now. The history, the covenant, the law, the blessings, the curses. But there's one last piece of this puzzle we haven't touched on yet. Moses isn't going to be the one leading them into the promised land. So what happens when it's time for him to, step down.
This is where we see a really powerful transition. Moses, knowing that he won't be crossing the Jordan River, he appoints Joshua to be his successor.
Yeah, and he doesn't just like hand him a map and say good luck. He gives Joshua some very specific instructions, right?
Yeah. He does. Be strong and courageous, because leading the Israelites into the Promised Land, conquering enemies, establishing their nation, let's just say it wasn't going to be a walk in the park.
Understatement of the century. It sounds like a terrifying amount of responsibility.
It was a monumental task. But Moses reassures him, tells Joshua he won't be alone. He says, "The Lord himself goes before you and will be with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged." And that promise, that assurance of God's presence, it echoes throughout all of Deuteronomy.
Wow. You know, that's a really good reminder for all of us, no matter what challenges we might be facing. But before Moses says his final farewell, he leaves them with one last gift, a song. And not just any song either, right?
You're talking about that song in Deuteronomy 32.
Yeah.
It's an incredible part of the text. It's this powerful, poetic masterpiece that sums up their entire history, their relationship with God, their tendency to, wander a bit, and the consequences of their choices.
It's almost like he's saying, remember this. Don't forget. Let this be a reminder, even when I'm gone.
Exactly. One last plea to remember all that they've been through and to stay true to that covenant.
Okay, so we've got this powerful song, a new leader who's ready to take charge, and the Israelites are on the brink of stepping into their future. But it doesn't end on a totally happy note, does it? I mean, what happens to Moses? It doesn't, does it? It's actually kind of bittersweet. Deuteronomy tells us that Moses climbed to the top of Mount Nebo, and from there, he sees it, the Promised Land, right there in front of him. This place he's been leading everyone towards for 40 years, but he can't enter it.
It's such a poignant image, isn't it? That deep yearning to reach the goal, but knowing you have to trust that, that the journey, it's prepared others to take it from here. And yet, even in that disappointment, Moses, he embodies everything Deuteronomy's been saying.
Yeah.
Obedience, even when it's hard.
And then he dies, right there on that mountaintop. I have to admit, that part always, gets to me a little. Makes you think about legacy. What we leave behind.
It does. And that's what's so amazing about Deuteronomy. It's not just Moses' story. It's a story that speaks to all of us, He dies without entering the Promised Land, but he leaves behind something so much more lasting. A legacy of faith, of obedience, a legacy that shaped the future of a nation.
Okay, yeah, I'm seeing that connection now between his story and our own. He had his Promised Land, that big goal. And, well, we all have things we're striving for, things we hope to achieve. But what happens when we hit those roadblocks? When we can't see the path forward? What can we learn from Moses even now?
You hit the nail on the head, right? Deuteronomy reminds us that even when we make mistakes, even when we face those never again moments, there's always a way back to God. And that's where hope comes in.
That's right. It's not just about avoiding those curses, those consequences we were talking about earlier. It's about embracing the blessings, living a life that reflects God, and making a difference in the world because of it.
Exactly. It's about looking beyond ourselves, considering what we're leaving behind. Are we living in a way that inspires others to follow God? Are we making choices that lead to blessings, not just for ourselves, but for everyone who comes after us?
Wow. It's a lot to think about. But it's also incredibly motivating at the same time. It's like Deuteronomy is giving us this roadmap. This guide to navigate all those big changes, those challenges life throws our way.
What a great way to put it. Deuteronomy, it's not just some ancient text. It's a timeless message of hope, of guidance, about the power of choosing faithfulness even when faced with the unknown. So as you stand on the edge of your own promised land, whatever that may be, remember those lessons from Deuteronomy and step forward with courage, knowing that God, he is with you every step of the way.